I want you to think about something for a moment. Think about the last time you blamed someone else for how you felt. Maybe it was your boss who made you angry, your partner who made you anxious, a friend who disappointed you, the traffic that ruined your morning, the weather that destroyed your plans. We do this constantly, don't we? We walk through life pointing fingers, convinced that our emotional states are the inevitable consequences of external circumstances. If only that person hadn't said that thing, if only this situation were different, if only the world would cooperate with what we want. But here's the uncomfortable truth that changes everything once you see it. No one makes you feel anything. Nothing makes you feel anything. Your emotions don't come from outside. They come from inside. They come from one place and one place only, your thoughts. This isn't some abstract philosophical idea. This is the fundamental mechanism of human consciousness. Between every event in your life and your emotional response to it sits something most people never notice, a thought, an interpretation, a meaning you've assigned. Someone cuts you off in traffic. That's just a physical event, one car changing lanes in front of another. But immediately, without conscious awareness, you think that person is disrespecting me, they think they're more important than me, this is unfair. And then comes the anger. But the anger didn't come from the car. It came from the thought about the car. Your boss criticizes your work. That's just words, sound waves in the air. But you think this means I'm not good enough, I'm going to lose my job, I'm a failure. And anxiety floods your system. Not because of what was said, but because of what you decided it meant. This is the machinery of suffering. And most people never look at it. They just feel the anger, feel the anxiety, and blame the world. But you are not most people, not anymore. Because once you understand this, once you truly see that your thoughts create your feelings, everything shifts. You stop being a victim of your emotions and become their architect. Think about the last time someone said something that upset you. Maybe it was a comment at work, a text from a friend that seemed cold, a look from a stranger. You felt hurt, angry, defensive. And in that moment, you were absolutely convinced that they times made you feel that way. Their words, their tone, their intentions. But here's what really happened. You had a times about what they said. You interpreted. You assigned meaning. You created a story about why they said it, what it meant about you, what it meant about them. And times that thought, times not their words, created your feeling. Two people can hear the exact same comment and feel completely different emotions. One feels insulted, the other feels nothing. One sees criticism, the other sees concern. Why? Because they're thinking different thoughts about the same event. Your colleague says, "You're quiet today." One person thinks, they think something's wrong with me. They're judging me and feels anxious. Another thinks they noticed I am not my usual self. They care and feels touched. Same words, different thoughts, entirely different emotional experiences. This is freedom. This is power. Not the power to control what happens to you, you can't. But the power to choose your thoughts, times about times, what happens to you. And through those thoughts, to choose how you feel. Most people live their entire lives at the mercy of their first thought. Something happens, a thought arises automatically, an emotion follows, and they accept it all as truth. They never question it. They never pause to ask, is this thought serving me? Is it even true? But you can question it. You can examine your thoughts the way a scientist examines evidence, with curiosity, not judgment, with honesty, not defensiveness. When you feel anger rising, you can ask, what am I thinking right now? And you'll find a thought there. Always, they disrespected me. This shouldn't be happening. I'm being treated unfairly. And then you can ask the deeper question, is that thought absolutely true? Could there be another way to see this? This isn't about denying reality or pretending everything is fine when it's not. It's about recognizing that between the event and your emotion, there's a thought. And that thought is where your power lives. Think about it this way. Two people lose their jobs on the same day. Same company, same position, same severance package. One person sees it as devastating proof that they're not good enough, that they've failed, that their future is now dark and uncertain. The other sees it as a difficult but potentially liberating moment, a chance to reassess, to pivot, to find work that might actually fulfill them. Same event, completely different inner weather. The difference isn't in what happened, it's in the story each person tells themselves about what happened. And here's what's liberating about this. If your thoughts create your feelings, and you can learn to observe and question your thoughts, then you're not imprisoned by your circumstances. You have agency, not over what happens to you, but over how you meet what happens to you. Now, I know what some of you might be thinking, but some thoughts are true. If I think I failed an exam and I actually did fail, isn't that just reality? Yes and no. Yes, you failed the exam. That's a fact. But I'm a failure is not a fact. I'll never succeed is not a fact. This means I'm stupid is not a fact. Those are interpretations, stories, and they're optional. The thought I failed this exam might lead you to study differently next time. That's useful. But the thought I'm a failure leads only to despair and paralysis. See the difference? This is why the quality of your thinking determines the quality of your life. Not your circumstances, not your history, your thinking. And the beautiful thing is you can train yourself to think more clearly, more compassionately, more truthfully. It's not about positive thinking or affirmations plastered over genuine pain. It's about discernment. It's about learning to separate fact from interpretation, event from story, reality from the anxiety-soaked narrative your mind spins when left unchecked. And this is where most people stumble. They believe they're responding to life as it is, when in reality, they're responding to their thoughts, times life. You lose your job, and within seconds, your mind constructs an entire catastrophe. You'll never find another position. Your skills are outdated. You lose your home. Everyone will see you as a failure. But pause. What actually happened? You lost a job. That's it. One job at one company on one day. The suffering isn't in the event. It's in the story you tell yourself about what that event means. I learned this the hard way, sitting in that Birmingham boarding house, watching men crumble under weights they'd entirely constructed themselves. One man convinced himself he was cursed because his business failed. Not that he'd made poor financial decisions or entered a saturated market. No, he was time's cursed asterisk. And so he walked through every new opportunity with that belief, coloring his vision, sabotaging himself at every turn, because deep down he believed himself to be fundamentally unlucky. Another believed the world was against him. Every setback became evidence of a grand conspiracy. Someone got the promotion he wanted. They must have connections. His idea wasn't chosen. Office politics. His relationship ended. She was never loyal anyway. He couldn't see that his bitterness was the poison, that his thoughts were the very thing repelling the success and connection he claimed to want. The mind, left unguarded, becomes a factory of suffering. It takes a neutral event and runs it through layers of fear, past trauma, future anxiety, and ego-driven interpretation until what emerges bears little resemblance to reality. You don't just experience a criticism, you experience humiliation, rejection, confirmation of your deepest inadequacies. You don't just face uncertainty, you experience impending doom. But here's what changes everything. You are not obligated to believe every thought that crosses your mind. Read that again. You are not obligated to believe every thought that crosses your mind. Your thoughts are not facts, they're often not even particularly accurate. They're just mental events, bubbles rising to the surface of consciousness, shaped by your conditioning, your fears, your unexamined beliefs. You've been treating them as gospel truth, building your entire reality around them, letting them dictate your choices, your relationship, your sense of what's possible. But what if you stopped? What if you started treating your thoughts the way you treat weather forecasts? Interesting information, sometimes useful, often wrong, but never the final word on reality. This is where everything shifts. I spent years believing I wasn't creative. That thought felt like bedrock, like something fundamental about my identity. And because I believed it, I never tried. I became a self-fulfilling prophecy. But that thought, it came from one art teacher in 3rd grade who said I needed improvement. One comment, one person, one moment. And I carried it for decades like it was carved in stone. When I finally questioned it, when I asked myself, is this actually true, or is this just a story I've been telling? The whole thing collapsed. Not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, like watching ice melt. I started sketching, badly at first, then less badly, then sometimes on good days, pretty well. The thought didn't disappear completely, but it lost its power. It went from being the narrator of my life to just background noise. That's the real work. Not positive thinking, not affirmations, but developing the capacity to see your thoughts as thoughts, not as truth, to create space between the thinker and the thought, to watch your mind throw up its anxious predictions and catastrophic scenarios and gently, persistently ask, is that so? Do I know that for certain? Most of the time, you don't. You're just projecting past patterns onto future possibilities and calling it prediction. What you'll discover, if you practice this quiet questioning, is that beneath the noise of worry lives something far more dependable. Not certainty, which is an illusion the anxious mind craves but can never truly possess, but presence, stillness, the simple recognition that right now, in this moment, you are okay. The anxious mind hates the present moment. It finds it unbearably boring, insufficiently dramatic. It wants to skip ahead to the imagined disaster or replay the past humiliation. Anything but here. Anything but now. Because in the now, there's nothing to solve, nothing to fix, nothing to anxiously prepare for. There's just breath, sensation, the ordinary miracle of being alive. I'm not suggesting some transcendent state of permanent peace. That's another trap, another should, that will make you feel inadequate when you inevitably fall short. I'm talking about something simpler and more accessible. The ability to return again and again to what is actually happening rather than what your mind insists might happen. This returning is not a one-time achievement. It's a practice you repeat 10,000 times. Each time anxiety pulls you into its fictional future, you notice, you breathe, you come back. Not with self-judgment, not with frustration that you wandered off again, but with the gentle firmness of a parent redirecting a distracted child. Yes, I hear you. Now come back here. Over time, something shifts. Not dramatically, not in some lightning bolt moment of enlightenment, but gradually, almost imperceptibly, the texture of your inner life changes. The gaps between anxious thoughts grow wider. The thoughts themselves lose some of their gravitational pull. You catch yourself less often in the middle of elaborately constructed worry narratives and more often in simple awareness of what's actually in front of you. And here's where something almost paradoxical happens. As you become less reactive to your thoughts, they gradually become less reactive themselves. The mental environment begins to shift not because you're suppressing anything, but because you're no longer feeding the patterns that generate so much unnecessary noise. You've stopped throwing logs on the fire. I remember the first time I realized a full day had passed without that familiar knot of dread in my stomach. Not because something wonderful had happened, but because nothing terrible had happened either, and more importantly, because I hadn't spent the day anticipating terrible things that might happen. The absence of that constant low-grade tension was so unfamiliar that I almost didn't recognize it. It felt like someone had turned down the volume on a noise I'd long since stopped consciously hearing. This is when you start to notice the secondary effects, the downstream consequences of a calmer mind. Your sleep improves because you're not lying awake rehearsing tomorrow's problems or reviewing today's mistakes. Your relationships change because you're actually listening instead of waiting for your turn to speak or mentally drafting your defense. Your decisions become clearer because you're not filtering everything through layers of anxiety and second-guessing. You find yourself spending less energy on impression management, that exhausting performance of trying to appear calm, competent, and together, while your inner world feels like it's constantly on the verge of collapse. When you're not battling your own mind quite so fiercely, you have more genuine attention available for the people and situations actually in front of you. The work itself becomes less about dramatic breakthroughs and more about subtle recalibration. You notice a thought spiraling, and you simply notice it sometimes. That's enough to interrupt the pattern. You catch yourself catastrophizing, and you pause, take a breath, return to what's actually happening rather than what might happen. These small redirections accumulate. They compound. Over time, you develop what I call cognitive leverage, the ability to shift your mental position with increasing ease. The thoughts don't stop coming. The negative patterns don't suddenly vanish, but your relationship to them changes fundamentally. You begin to notice the quality of your thinking before you're completely swept away by it. There's a gap that opens up between stimulus and response, between trigger and reaction. In that gap lives your freedom. This is where the real transformation happens, not in the absence of difficulty, but in the presence of awareness during difficulty. Consider the difference between two people facing the same setback. One person experiences rejection and immediately identifies with it. I'm not good enough. I never was. This proves what I've always suspected about myself. The thought and the self become one. The other person experiences the same rejection and notices the arising of those thoughts. There's the familiar pattern of self-doubt. There's the old story about not being enough. Same situation, same initial emotional response, but a fundamentally different relationship to the experience. The first person is consumed by their thinking. The second person is aware of their thinking. That awareness, that small degree of separation, changes everything. Your thoughts lose their hypnotic power when you see them clearly. The narrative that once seemed like absolute truth reveals itself as just one possible interpretation among many. You realize you've been living in a story you didn't consciously choose, believing a voice that was never really you. This doesn't mean you become emotionless or detached. You don't stop caring. In fact, the opposite often happens. When you're not constantly defending against your own thoughts, you have more energy available for genuine connection, for meaningful work, for life itself. There's a Buddhist teacher I once read who said something that stayed with me. You can't stop the birds from flying over your head, but you can stop them from building a nest in your hair. That's what we're talking about here. Thoughts will come, that's what minds do. Anxious thoughts, critical thoughts, random thoughts about why giraffes have long necks or whether your second grade teacher remembers you. But just because a thought arises doesn't mean you have to invite it in for tea, give it a room, and let it redecorate your entire mental house. Most of us have been living with mental tenants we never actually agreed to host. They showed up years ago, maybe decades ago, and we just assumed they owned the place. That voice that says you're not enough, you didn't choose it. It chose you, probably when you were too young to question it. And it's been collecting rent ever since, in the form of your peace, your confidence, your sleep. But here's what changes everything. The moment you realize you're not the voice, you're the one hearing the voice, the entire game shifts. You stop arguing with it. You stop trying to convince it. You stop negotiating. Because you don't negotiate with furniture. You don't have deep conversations with the couch about whether you're worthy of sitting on it. You just sit, or you don't. Either way, the couch doesn't get a vote. And anxiety is exactly the same. It's there, it has its little opinions, it thinks it knows things, but it doesn't get a vote on what you do today. It can ride along in the car fine, whatever, but it's not driving, and it's definitely not reading the map. This isn't about never feeling anxiety again. That's not the goal, and honestly, it would be weird if you never felt it. Anxiety is part of the human alarm system. Sometimes it's useful. If you're crossing the street and a car is coming, that spike of adrenaline, that's anxiety doing its job. But here's where things get twisted. Here's where the whole system breaks down. That same mechanism, that same alarm system that's supposed to protect you from actual danger can't tell the difference between a speeding car and a text message you haven't answered, between a predator in the grass and your boss asking to have a quick chat. Your body responds the same way. That's the cruelty of it. Your nervous system is operating with Stone Age software in a digital age. It's running on hardware designed for threats you could fight or run from. But you can't fight your mortgage. You can't run from your own thoughts at 3 in the morning. And so the alarm keeps ringing. The adrenaline keeps pumping. The cortisol keeps flooding your system. Your body stays in a state of emergency over things that aren't emergencies at all. That notification on your phone, your body treats it like a threat. That silence after you send a vulnerable message, your nervous system interprets it as danger. That vague sense that something bad might happen even though nothing specific is wrong. Your brain is scanning for threats the way it's been trained to do for thousands of years. Except now it's finding them everywhere because everything is uncertain, everything is complex, everything is ambiguous. We're living in a world where actual physical danger is historically low, but perceived threats are everywhere, and your body can't tell the difference. So you end up anxious about being anxious. You worry about the fact that you're worrying. The alarm system becomes the threat, and that's where most people get stuck. They think the goal is to turn off anxiety completely, to never feel it again, to somehow transcend or eliminate this fundamental part of being human. But that's not the goal. That's not even possible. The goal isn't to stop feeling anxiety. The goal is to change your relationship with it, to understand what it is, why it's there, and how to work with it instead of being controlled by it. Because anxiety isn't the enemy. It never was. The enemy is the story you tell yourself about what anxiety means. It's the belief that this feeling means you're broken, that you're weak, that you're failing at something everyone else has figured out. But none of that is true. What you're feeling is ancient. It's been passed down through countless generations, wired into your nervous system as protection. The problem isn't the anxiety itself. It's that you're trying to live a modern life with an alarm system designed for a world that no longer exists. Think about this for a second. Your ancestors lived in environments where real threats were everywhere. A rustling in the bushes could mean a predator. Being rejected by the tribe could mean death. Every loud noise, every strange smell, every unfamiliar face, these were potential dangers that required immediate response. So your brain developed this incredible surveillance system, constantly scanning for threats, ready to flood your body with chemicals at the first sign of trouble. And it worked. You're here because that system worked brilliantly for thousands of years. But now, Now that same system treats a work email like a charging bear. It treats social rejection like exile from the tribe. It can't tell the difference between standing up to give a presentation and standing up to fight for your life. The threat detection system is still operating on ancient code, but you're living in a completely different operating system. So you get anxious about things that aren't actually dangerous. Your heart races before a date, your stomach churns before a meeting. You lie awake at night replaying conversations, analyzing tones, searching for threats and casual comment. And because the physical sensations are so intense, so overwhelming, you believe something must be terribly wrong. But what if nothing is wrong? What if your body is just doing its job, it's just doing it in the wrong context? Your nervous system doesn't know the difference between an actual threat and a perceived threat. It can't tell the difference between a lion in the room and a thought about a lion that times might be in the room. To your body, danger is danger. And when you start believing that the sensations themselves are dangerous, you create the very loop that keeps the whole thing going. This is why reassurance doesn't work. This is why all those doctor visits, all those tests, all those Google searches never quite settle the question. Because you're not actually looking for information, you're looking for a guarantee. You want someone to promise you that nothing bad will happen, and that's a promise no one can make. So instead, you collect evidence, you become a detective of your own demise, you notice every flutter, every twinge, every variation in your heartbeat. And each time you notice something, you interpret it through the lens of threat. The sensations aren't just sensations anymore, they're signals, they're warnings. They're your body trying to tell you that something is catastrophically wrong. But here's what's actually happening. You're training your nervous system to be more sensitive. Every time you check, every time you scan your body for problems, every time you stop what you're doing to assess whether this feeling means something terrible, you're reinforcing the pattern. You're teaching your brain that these sensations matter, that they require attention, that they're worth interrupting your life for. And your brain is an excellent student. It learns quickly, so it starts alerting you more frequently. It turns up the volume on sensations you used to ignore. It creates a hair trigger response where there used to be nothing at all. This is neuroplasticity working against you. The same mechanism that allows you to learn a language or master an instrument is now making you an expert at detecting threat where none exists. Your brain has become so good at finding danger that it can manufacture it out of thin air. Think about what this means. Your mind has essentially trained itself in reverse. Instead of building confidence through repetition, you've built fear through repetition. Every time you've checked your heart rate, you've reinforced the neural pathway that says this sensation is important and potentially dangerous. Every time you've sought reassurance from a doctor, you've strengthened the connection between normal sensation and medical crisis. Every time you've avoided a situation because it might trigger anxiety, you've confirmed to your brain that the situation was indeed dangerous. You've become a master practitioner of something you never wanted to learn. And here's what makes this particularly insidious. You can't think your way out of it. You already know intellectually that you're probably fine. You've been to doctors. You've had tests. You've researched your symptoms online until 3 in the morning. You know the statistics. You know the rational explanations. But knowing doesn't change the feeling, because the feeling isn't coming from your rational mind. It's coming from these rewired pathways, these hair trigger alarm systems that now operate below the level of conscious thought. It's like trying to convince yourself not to pull your hand away from a hot stove. The withdrawal happens before you can think about it. This is why reassurance doesn't work. This is why all those hours spent convincing yourself you're okay provide relief that lasts maybe 10 minutes, maybe an hour, before the doubt creeps back in. You're trying to use logic to override a system that operates on instinct and repetition. The neural pathways don't respond to rational argument. They respond to pattern and experience. And the pattern they've learned is fear, check, relief, repeat. The experience they've accumulated is that bodily sensations mean danger. So what do you do with this understanding? How do you begin to rewire what's been wired so thoroughly? The answer isn't what most people expect. You don't fight the patterns. You don't wage war against your own mind. Because here's what happens when you try to force change through sheer willpower. You create more tension, more resistance, more of the very suffering you're trying to escape. I learned this the hard way. Years of trying to think differently, to override my negativity with positive affirmations, to muscle my way into a better mindset. And what did I get? Exhaustion, frustration. And eventually they collapse back into the same old patterns, but now with an added layer of failure on top. The change that actually works, the transformation that lasts, comes from a completely different place. It comes from understanding, not intellectual understanding, though that's where it starts, but lived understanding, the kind that seeps into your bones. When you truly see how a thought creates a feeling, when you watch it happen in real time without judgment, something shifts. You're no longer identified with the thought, you're the observer of it. And in that space between stimulus and response, between thought and reaction, freedom begins to emerge. Let me give you something practical. The next time you notice yourself spiraling caught in anxiety, anger, or despair, pause. Not to stop the feeling, but to study it. Ask yourself, what thought just went through my mind? What story am I telling myself right now? You might notice you're thinking, this always happens to me, or I'll never get what I want, or people can't be trusted. You'll catch yourself catastrophizing, predicting the worst, replaying the past, projecting into a future that hasn't happened. And here's the key. Don't argue with the thought. Don't try to replace it with something positive. Just see it. See it as a thought, not as reality, not as truth. Just as a mental event, arising and passing, like a cloud moving across the sky. This simple act of observation begins to loosen the grip. The thought loses its power when you stop believing it's an accurate reporter of reality. And here's what's remarkable. When you practice this consistently, you begin to notice patterns. The same worry that gripped you on Monday shows up again on Thursday wearing a slightly different costume. The anxious thought that visited you last month returns this month with the same tired script. You start to see that your mind is running old programs, repeating familiar loops. This recognition is profoundly liberating because once you see the pattern, once you recognize the repetition, you understand that these thoughts aren't responding to present reality, they're echoes of the past. Your mind is playing a recording, and you've been treating it like a live broadcast. I remember sitting in my garden one afternoon, watching this process unfold in real time. A worry arose about a conversation I needed to have the following week. My mind immediately began scripting the entire interaction, predicting conflict, imagining worst-case scenarios, but this time I simply watched. I noticed the familiar tightness in my chest, the acceleration of my heartbeat, the cascade of related worries that tried to pile on, and I realized this was the same worry pattern that had shown up before dozens of similar conversations. Not one of those previous conversations had unfolded the way my mind predicted, not one. Yet here was my mind, confidently forecasting disaster again, and here was my body, responding as if the disaster were already happening. When you see this clearly, when you really see it, something shifts. You begin to hold your thoughts more lightly. You develop what I can only describe as a friendly skepticism toward your own mental commentary. You stop granting it automatic authority. This doesn't mean your thoughts become unimportant or that you ignore genuine concerns. It means you become discerning. You learn the difference between a thought that deserves your attention and a thought that's simply making noise, between wisdom and worry, between intuition and habit. This discernment becomes your compass. It doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It arrives quietly, like the first light of dawn, so gradual you almost miss it, until suddenly you realize you can see clearly what was once hidden in shadow. I've watched people develop this faculty over years of practice, and the transformation is always subtle yet profound. They stop jumping at every mental provocation. Stop treating every anxious thought as a crisis requiring immediate action. Stop mistaking the volume of a thought for its validity. There's a woman I knew who spent 2 decades in a career that left her feeling hollow. Every Sunday evening, that familiar dread would settle in her chest. She'd think, this is just how life is. This is what being responsible looks like. She accepted that narrative without question. The way you might accept that rain is wet or stone is hard. But when she began observing her thoughts with real attention, something shifted. She noticed that the thought, this is just how life is, carried a different quality than thoughts like, I need to call my mother, or the garden needs watering. Those practical thoughts had a clean, simple texture. But this is just how life is. That thought had weight to it, a kind of dull resignation that felt learned rather than true. She began to distinguish between thoughts that emerged from genuine wisdom and thoughts that emerged from fear dressed up as wisdom. The fear thoughts always had that quality of closing down, of making the world smaller. The true thoughts, even when they were difficult, carried a sense of opening, of possibility, of life moving forward. This is what mental sovereignty looks like in practice. I began to notice something else, something quite remarkable. As I practiced this careful observation, As I became more skilled at distinguishing between these two types of thoughts, the fear thoughts began to lose their power over me. Not because I fought them, not because I denied them, but simply because I saw them clearly. There's a profound principle at work here, one I've observed countless times. That which is fully seen loses its capacity to deceive. A fear thought derives its entire power from being mistaken for truth. The moment you recognize it as simply a fear thought, a mental reaction born of anxiety rather than a perception born of wisdom, it can no longer control you in the same way. I remember one evening, sitting in my small room, when a particularly fierce wave of worry swept through my mind. The old familiar panic about my future, about whether I would ever amount to anything, about whether all this inner work was just elaborate self-deception. The thoughts came with such intensity, such apparent urgency. But this time, I didn't grab on to them. I didn't argue with them. I simply observed them, as I might observe clouds moving across the sky. And I asked myself that question, is this a fear thought or a true thought? The answer was immediately clear. The thoughts had that signature quality, that contracted, closing feeling, that sense of the world getting smaller and darker. And in recognizing them for what they were, something shifted. The thoughts didn't disappear. They continued for a while, but I was no longer imprisoned by them. I was watching them, not living inside them. There was space around them now, breathing room. This is what freedom of mind actually means. Not the absence of difficult thoughts or painful emotions, but the ability to remain conscious in their presence, to observe without being swept away, to distinguish between the voice of fear and the voice of wisdom. This distinction is critical. The voice of fear speaks in absolutes. You can't. You're not enough. It's too late. You'll fail. It presents speculation as certainty, possibility as inevitability. It takes a single moment and projects it into an eternal future of suffering. The voice of wisdom speaks differently. It acknowledges difficulty without declaring defeat. This is challenging, and you have faced challenges before. This feels uncertain, and uncertainty is part of growth. This may not work, and the attempt itself has value. Fear demands immediate action to escape discomfort. Wisdom counsels thoughtful response aligned with your deeper value. I learned this distinction not through philosophy, but through repeated observation of my own mental patterns. I noticed that my most regrettable decisions were made when I was trying to escape a feeling, when I was acting not toward something I valued, but away from something I feared. The job I quit impulsively because criticism made me uncomfortable. The relationship I sabotaged because intimacy triggered old wounds. The creative project I abandoned because early feedback bruised my ego. Each time, I believed I was being decisive, taking control. In reality, I was being controlled by the desperate need to make discomfort stop. Compare this to decisions made from a place of centered awareness, not the absence of fear, but the willingness to feel it while still moving forward. These decisions had a different quality. They felt less urgent but more certain, less reactive but more powerful. The difference wasn't in external circumstances, it was in my relationship to my internal experience. This is what self-mastery ultimately means, not controlling what you feel, but choosing how you respond, not eliminating the storm, but learning to stand steady within it. And here's what makes this possible: the space between stimulus and response. Viktor Frankl, who survived concentration camps, understood this profoundly. Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. That space is created by awareness. Without it, stimulus and response are fused. Someone criticizes you, and instantly you're defensive. You feel anxious, and immediately you're reaching for distraction. The thought arrives, and you're already believing it, acting on it, becoming it. Awareness creates separation. The criticism still comes. The anxiety still rises. The thought still appears. But now there's a moment, brief, perhaps, but infinitely significant, where you can observe before you react. This space between stimulus and response, this is freedom. Not the freedom to never feel anxiety, but the freedom to choose what you do with it. The mountain of stress doesn't vanish, but you discover something extraordinary. You were never required to carry it in the first place. I've seen people transform entirely through this realization. A woman who spent 15 years believing she was fundamentally broken, destined for a lifetime of medication and management, discovered she could simply observe her racing thoughts without believing them. She described it like this: It's as if I'd been wearing glasses that made everything look terrifying, and I didn't know I could take them off. The glasses are the attachment, the believing that these thoughts mean something about who you are, the investment in the narrative that says, this feeling proves I am not okay. When you stop investing, something shifts. You're still experiencing the weather of your inner world, the storms, the clouds, the occasional sunshine, but you're no longer confusing the weather for the sky itself. You are the sky, vast, unchanging, capable of holding it all. This is where the real healing begins, not in the elimination of symptoms, but in the fundamental shift of relationship. You move from being a victim of your mind to being the conscious space in which your mind operates. And here's what nobody tells you about this shift. It's not dramatic. There's no lightning bolt, no sudden absence of all difficulty. It's more like waking up in a house you've lived in your whole life and noticing for the first time that all the doors were unlocked. You were never trapped. You simply believed you were. The anxiety attacks may still come. The intrusive thoughts might still appear. But you're no longer asking, what's wrong with me? Instead, you're asking, what is this trying to teach me? You're learning to be with yourself in the difficult moments, not just the comfortable ones. And that changes everything. I had a moment last month that crystallized this for me. I was lying in bed at 3 in the morning, heart pounding, mind spinning with catastrophic scenarios about the future, classic anxiety spiral. But here's what was different. I didn't fight it. I didn't reach for my phone to distract myself. I didn't try to logic my way out of it or shame myself for feeling this way. I just lay there and said to myself, this is hard. This feels terrible. And it's okay that I'm experiencing this. That simple acknowledgement was like opening a pressure valve. The anxiety didn't vanish, but something in me relaxed. I stopped being anxious, times being anxious. I stopped adding that second layer of suffering on top of the first. And then I asked myself, what do I actually need right now? Not what should I need, not what would someone else need, but what do I times need in this moment? The answer came quietly. I needed to feel safe. I needed to remember that I've survived every difficult moment before this one. I needed to stop treating my own mind like an enemy and start treating it like a frightened child who just needs some reassurance. So I put my hand on my chest and took slow breaths. I reminded myself of the facts. I'm in my bed. I'm physically safe. Nothing is actually happening right now. The threat my mind is creating isn't real in this moment. I spoke to myself the way I would speak to someone I love who was scared. This simple act, this gentle acknowledgement didn't make the anxiety disappear. That's not how it works. But it shifted something fundamental. It created space between me and the storm. Instead of being the anxiety, I was the person experiencing anxiety. There's a profound difference there. I stayed with the discomfort. I didn't try to fix it or force it away. I breathed through it, reminding myself that feelings, no matter how intense, are temporary. They rise, they peak, they fall, like waves. And just like a wave, if you try to fight it, you'll exhaust yourself. But if you move with it, if you let it pass through you, it loses its power to control you. Over time, this practice became my anchor. Not perfection, not the absence of anxiety, just this simple returning to the present, this gentle self-compassion in the middle of the storm. Some nights were easier than others. Some nights the anxiety still won, and I'd lie awake for hours. But even then, I was learning. I was building a different relationship with my own mind. Here's what I want you to understand. Healing doesn't mean you'll never feel anxious again. It doesn't mean every night will be peaceful. What it means is that you develop the tools to navigate the difficult moments without being completely overtaken by them. You learn to be with yourself in a kinder way. The other piece that transformed my relationship with nighttime anxiety was reframing how I viewed sleep itself. For so long I had turned sleep into another performance, another thing I had to succeed at. I would lie there calculating hours. If I fall asleep right now, I'll get 6 hours. Okay, now 5.5, now 5. Each passing minute felt like failure. The pressure I put on myself to sleep perfectly only fed the very anxiety that kept me awake. It became a vicious cycle, a self-fulfilling prophecy of sleeplessness. I had to let go of that. I had to release my grip on controlling something that, by its very nature, requires surrender. Sleep isn't something you make happen through force of will. It's something you allow. This was my second acceptance. I couldn't control my thoughts during the day any more than I could at night. That anxious mind that kept me awake at 3 a.m., that was the same mind I carried with me through every waking hour. The only difference was that during the day, I had distraction. Work, conversations, emails, music, scrolling 1,000 small ways to avoid being alone with the noise in my head. But in the dark, there was nowhere to hide. I began to see insomnia not as a nighttime problem, but as a daytime problem that revealed itself at night. The anxiety I experienced when I couldn't sleep was the same anxiety I pushed down during the day. The racing thoughts weren't created by sleeplessness, they were simply uncovered by it. This realization changed everything. I stopped trying to fix my nights and started examining my days. What was I carrying? What was I holding on to? What conversations was I replaying? What outcomes was I trying to control? What version of the future was I mentally rehearsing over and over? I noticed patterns. Every time I had a difficult conversation coming up, my sleep suffered the night before. Not because I was genuinely working through the problem, but because I was mentally rehearsing 1,000 variations of something that hadn't happened yet. I was living through an imaginary future, experiencing imaginary conflicts, defending myself against imaginary criticism. The mind, I learned, doesn't distinguish between a real threat and an imagined one. The body responds the same way. The cortisol, the alertness, the quickened heartbeat, it's all the same, whether you're running from a predator or lying in bed worrying about an email you need to send tomorrow. And here's what made it worse. I was generating these threats myself, voluntarily, on an endless loop. I started to see it everywhere once I understood it. The same pattern playing out in different forms. Every time I caught myself catastrophizing about the future, I'd check in with my body. Tight chest, check. Shallow breathing, check. The fight or flight system, fully activated. But nothing was actually happening. I was sitting in a chair, safe. The threat existed only in the projection I was creating. And then I realized something even more uncomfortable. I was addicted to it. There's a strange comfort in worry. It feels productive. It feels like you're doing something about the problem, even though you're not. You're just rehearsing disasters that haven't happened and probably never will. But your nervous system can't tell the difference between rehearsal and reality. I read somewhere that the average person has about 60,000 thoughts per day, and for most people, about 80% of those thoughts are negative, 80%. And of those negative thoughts, 95% are repetitive, the same worries, the same fears, the same mental movies playing on loop. We're essentially running the same disaster scenarios through our minds over and over, wondering why we feel exhausted. The present moment started to look very different to me after this realization. When I actually paid attention to what was happening right now, not 5 minutes from now, not what happened yesterday, but this exact moment, it was almost always fine. The coffee was warm, the chair was comfortable, I could breathe, my heart was beating, the basics were handled. The suffering was always in the gap between now and the imagined future I was worried about, or the gap between now and the past I was ruminating over. That gap, that's where I was living. And that gap isn't real. It's a mental construct. It's a story. Once you truly see that, once you understand that your limits are self-imposed, the entire landscape of your life shifts. Because here's what happens next. You start questioning everything. Every I can't becomes why can't I? Every that's impossible becomes who decided that? Every boundary you thought was concrete reveals itself as negotiable. And this is where most people feel resistance. Because we've spent our whole lives building these stories. We've defended them. We've used them to protect ourselves from failure, from judgment, from the fear of trying and falling short. These limiting beliefs aren't just thoughts. They're fortresses we've constructed around our comfort zones. We've invested in them. We've made them part of our identity. When I was younger, I believed I wasn't creative. I told myself that story for years. And you know what? I had evidence. I couldn't draw. I wasn't musical. I saw other people produce beautiful things effortlessly, and I concluded that's not me. But that belief was based on a definition of creativity I'd absorbed from somewhere, school, maybe, or culture, or comparison. I never questioned it. I just accepted it as fact. Until one day, someone challenged me. They said, problem solving is creative. Finding new ways to explain old ideas is creative. Building systems is creative. And suddenly, my fortress cracked. Because I did those things. I did them all the time. I just never called them creative because they didn't fit the narrow definition I'd been carrying around. The belief wasn't truth. It was a filter. And it was filtering out evidence that contradicted it while amplifying anything that confirmed it. This is what your thoughts do. They don't just describe reality. They create the lens through which you interpret it. And when you change the lens, you change what you see. You start noticing opportunities you overlooked. You start recognizing strengths you dismissed. You start acting in ways that were previously unthinkable, not because you became a different person, but because you stopped limiting yourself with old definitions. This is the power of thought awareness, not positive thinking, not affirmations, but the simple, profound act of seeing your thoughts for what they are, tools, not truths. Because here's what most people miss. Your thoughts create feelings, and feelings create actions, and actions create your life. It's not mystical, it's mechanical. Like a seed becoming a tree, the process is inevitable once set in motion. You plant fear, you harvest hesitation. You plant resentment, you harvest isolation. You plant doubt, you harvest missed opportunities. But plant something else, the harvest changes completely. I'm not talking about pretending. I'm talking about redirecting. When the thought comes, I always mess this up. You don't have to believe it. You can look at it, acknowledge it, and then ask, is this helping me move toward what I want, or is it keeping me trapped where I am? That question changes everything, because most of us live as if our thoughts are dictators we must obey, but they're not. They're suggestions, and you get to decide which suggestions you follow. I watch people transform their entire existence by simply stopping to question the stories they've been telling themselves. The man who believed he was bad with money starts tracking expenses suddenly. He's not. The woman who was convinced she couldn't lead volunteers to run one meeting and discovers she can. The thoughts didn't change first. The decision to test them did. And here's the beautiful, terrifying truth. You're already creating your life with your thoughts. Right now, today. The question isn't whether they have power, it's whether you're wielding that power consciously or letting it run wild. Most people sleepwalk through their mental landscape, letting weeds grow everywhere, wondering why their garden produces nothing but thorns. But you can wake up. You can become the gardener instead of just the ground. You can choose which seeds get water, which get pulled, which get planted deeper. Not overnight, not with a single affirmation, but thought by thought, choice by choice, moment by moment. This is the work. This is the path. Not to some distant paradise, but to the life that's possible right here when you stop letting every random thought dictate your direction. And here's what no one tells you about this work. It gets easier. Not because your circumstances suddenly become perfect, not because the world stops throwing problems at your feet, but because you stop being ruled by the exhausting tyranny of reactivity. You know what takes more energy than anything else? Being jerked around by every thought that crosses your mind, waking up anxious because your brain decided to catastrophize at 3 a.m., snapping at someone you love because a stray irritation hijacked your mouth, abandoning your goals because a moment of doubt whispered that you're not good enough. That's exhausting. That's the hard way to live. Compare that to the person who's learned to observe their thoughts, who feels the anxiety rise but doesn't immediately believe the story it's telling, who notices the irritation but chooses their response, who hears the doubt but moves forward anyway. They're not superhuman. They're not emotionless robots. They've just stopped doing the hardest thing in the world, which is letting every mental impulse run their life. I've watched this transformation happen, sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly. The person who was constantly overwhelmed, always one crisis away from falling apart, they start to stabilize. Not because their life got easier, but because they stopped making it harder with their own undisciplined thinking. The complainer who poisoned every room they entered, they start to see how exhausting it is to maintain that identity, how much energy it takes to find fault with everything. And slowly, not through forced positivity, but through simple awareness, they start to let it go. The person convinced they were a victim of circumstance, they begin to notice the tiny choices they make every day, the thoughts they entertain, the perspectives they adopt, the actions they take or don't take. And with that awareness comes something revolutionary, agency. This is the promise of this work. Not that you'll never struggle, not that you'll transcend being human, but that you'll stop being your own worst enemy. You learn to work times with times yourself, not against yourself. And maybe that's the most profound shift of all, the moment you realize you don't need to be fixed. Because you were never broken. You were just operating from incomplete instruction. You were trying to build a life with a manual written by people who didn't know you, who didn't understand your wiring, your rhythms, your particular brand of chaos and brilliance. Now you're writing your own manual. And here's the beautiful paradox. The more you accept yourself as you are, the more you naturally evolve into who you're capable of becoming. Not through force, not through shame, but through the simple, revolutionary act of creating conditions where you can thrive. I've watched this transformation in my own life. I've seen it in the lives of countless others. The chronic procrastinator who finally understands they're not lazy, they're waiting for the right kind of pressure, the right kind of deadline, the right alignment of urgency and interest. So they stop trying to be someone who works steadily every day, and instead they build systems that harness their natural sprint-style productivity. The anxious overthinker who realizes they're not weak, they're highly sensitive to potential problems, which makes them extraordinary at risk assessment. So they stop trying to just relax, and instead they channel that energy into preparation, into contingency planning, into becoming the person everyone turns to when things go sideways. The person who's always been too much, too loud, too emotional, too intense, who finally understands that their capacity for feeling isn't a flaw, it's their superpower. So they stop trying to dim themselves, and instead they find spaces where intensity is celebrated, where passion is fueled, where their particular frequency resonates. They stop seeking approval from people who are never going to understand them anyway, and instead they build communities with others who speak the same emotional language, who don't flinch at their fire but add their own flames to it. This is the fundamental shift from trying to fit your truth into someone else's framework to building a framework that honors your truth. From asking, how can I make myself acceptable, to declaring, this is who I am. These are the conditions under which I thrive. And here's what nobody tells you about this transition. It's not a single moment of revelation. It's not one dramatic scene where you stand on a table and announce your authentic self to the world. It's 1,000 small choices made daily, often invisibly. It's the decision to say no to the networking event that drains you and yes to the quiet evening that restores you. It's choosing the project that fascinates you over the one that merely impresses others. It's the conversation where you risk honesty instead of performing agreement. Each choice is a small declaration of sovereignty. Each decision is a brick in the foundation of a life that's actually yours. And gradually, something extraordinary happens. The dissonance fades, the exhaustion lifts. Not because life becomes easier, it doesn't, but because the energy you were spending on pretense is now available for actual living. The cognitive load of maintaining a false self, of constantly monitoring and adjusting and performing, is immense. When you drop it, suddenly you have resources you'd forgotten you possessed. You have attention for what actually matters, energy for genuine connection, capacity for the work that calls to you. The creativity that was being suffocated by conformity suddenly has room to breathe, to expand, to surprise you. This is when people start saying you've changed, that you seem different somehow. And they're right, but not in the way they think. You haven't become someone new. You finally stopped being someone you never were. You've simply allowed what was always true about you to become visible. And yes, some people won't like it. Some will feel betrayed by your authenticity, as if your previous performance was a promise you're now breaking. But here's what I've learned. Those who truly matter will adjust. They might need time. They might fumble for a while, calling you by the wrong name or slipping back into old patterns of relating to you. But if the relationship has genuine substance, they'll make the effort. They'll ask questions. They'll listen. They'll expand their understanding of who you are because they value the connection more than their comfort with a fixed version of you. And those who can't, those who refuse to see you as anything other than the character you once played for survival, you'll grieve those losses. That's real. Don't let anyone tell you that authenticity comes without cost. But what you gain in exchange, the ability to breathe fully, to speak truthfully, to build relationships based on who you actually are, that's worth every uncomfortable conversation, every disappointed face, every friendship that couldn't evolve. I think about the people in my life who've made this transition with me, not perfectly, not without awkwardness or misunderstandings, but with genuine effort. And what I've discovered is that those relationships have deepened in ways I never anticipated. Because when you stop performing, you give others permission to do the same. Your authenticity creates a space where real connection becomes possible, where vulnerability isn't a liability but a language that both people speak. The final truth I want to leave you with is this. Your obligation is not to remain who you were for the convenience of others. Your obligation is to become who you are as fully and honestly as you can manage. Not with cruelty, not with unnecessary drama, but with firm, compassionate honesty about what you need to thrive. This is the work. Not building a mask, not learning to hide better, but dismantling the architecture of performance and standing in the full, complicated, imperfect truth of yourself. It's terrifying, it's liberating, and it's the only path forward that doesn't require you to abandon yourself along the way. So show up as you are, let them adjust or not. Grieve what must be grieved, and keep walking toward the life that fits the truth of who you've always been.